Japanese versus Korean. Which is more difficult to learn? I'm a Japanese citizen, but Japanese wasn't my first language. I learned it in my early 20s, and it has become one of the main languages of my adult life. Korean, on the other hand, I've studied on and off for over 40 years. I still have a lot to improve, but I've come far enough to say this. I'm in a unique position to give a fair and detailed comparison of the challenges each language presents. Whether you're just starting out or deciding which path to take, I'll break down 5 key aspects for you: the writing system, vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and the politeness levels. Okay, let's start with aspect 1, the writing systems. When it comes to the writing systems, the difference between Japanese and Korean is not just noticeable, it's dramatic. The Korean script Hangul was created in the 15th century by King Sejong and his scholars with one goal in mind: make reading and writing accessible to everyone. Hangul is an alphabet or syllabary, and it's incredibly logical. It has just 24 basic letters, 14 consonants, and 10 vowels. And syllables are neatly formed by stacking these letters into blocks. Most learners can begin reading simple words after just a few hours of study. While Chinese characters, hanja, were historically used in Korean, today they're rarely seen outside of academic or formal settings, sometimes in newspaper headlines. For everyday reading and writing, signs, books, websites, messages, Hangul is all you'll need. Now compare that to Japanese, which uses 3 scripts simultaneously. Kanji borrowed from Chinese, of which you need to know 2,000 plus characters just to read a newspaper. Then you have hiragana, used for grammar, particles, and native words. And finally, katakana, used for foreign terms, emphasis, and technical vocabulary. What makes Japanese even more difficult than Chinese is that kanji often have multiple readings, sometimes 4, 5, or more, depending on the word, the context, and whether it appears in a compound. I get into this subject deeply in the video I made, Chinese versus Japanese. Then there's the additional challenge of knowing when to use which script. For a learner, it's not just about memorizing thousands of characters. It's also about mastering the interplay between these scripts and multiple pronunciation systems. The Japanese writing system is the most complex in the world. Japanese demands an entirely different level of memorization, pattern recognition, and long-term commitment. The Korean writing system is fast to learn, slow to master. The Japanese writing system is slow to learn and even slower to master. Now let's look at aspect 2. Vocabulary. When comparing vocabulary in Korean and Japanese, we're dealing with 3 main sources in both languages: native words, Sino-derived vocabulary of Chinese origin, loan words, mostly from English and other modern languages. But how these sources interact and how predictable they are varies greatly between the 2 languages. Korean vocabulary, just like Japanese and Vietnamese, includes a large proportion of words from ancient Chinese. But here's the key. Each Chinese character used in Korean, hanja, typically has only one standardized pronunciation. This system emerged during the unified Silla period, 8th century, when Korean scholars reformed Chinese readings into what became known as Eastern sounds. These readings are fixed, predictable, and unlike Japanese, where the same character can be pronounced in multiple ways. As a result, once the learner becomes familiar with common roots, compound words become relatively transparent. Even if these compounds are abstract, their structure is logical and repeatable. At the same time, everyday Korean speech relies heavily on native Korean words, which are often shorter, more emotionally expressive, and less regular in comparison to their Sino-Korean counterparts. These native words form the core of casual, intimate communication, while the more formal Sino vocabulary is common in academic or official settings. This means learners can often function with basic fluency using native vocabulary before tackling the dense Sino-Korean layer used in formal or academic contexts. As I mentioned, Japanese vocabulary is also divided into native words, native Japanese words, Sino-Japanese, and loan words from other languages than Chinese. But its main difficulty is in unpredictability. A single kanji character can have multiple readings, onyomi, Chinese-based readings, and usually there's more than one reading, kunyomi, native Japanese readings, tied to meaning, not sound. Learners must memorize each vocabulary item almost as an individual case. Add to this the fact that Japanese often has multiple words for the same idea, each with its own nuance and level of politeness. This is true for both Japanese and Korean, but more elaborate in Japanese. Japanese often has several distinct words and a single concept depending on formality, humility, elevation, or nuance. Take, for example, the verb to see, the lowest form, miru. Then we have goran ni naru, which is the honorific form, and haiken suru, which is the humble form. Or, for example, the verb to do, suru, nasaru, honorific, itasu, humble. Korean also distinguishes formality and politeness levels, but the difference is mainly expressed through grammar, verb endings, and sometimes through verb stems. So Korean does have different words for politeness levels, especially in verbs related to the body or daily acts, such as sleep, eat, speak. But it has less lexical variety overall than Japanese in these terms. The grammar does more work in the politeness levels system in Korean than it does in Japanese. Homophones are common due to limited sound combinations. Japanese has a very small sound inventory, which means many words share the exact same pronunciation, especially Kongo, Sino-Japanese words. Korean has more distinct syllables and slightly more phonological variety. It still has homophones, especially among Sino-Korean words, but they are less frequent and less problematic in context. The use of spacing between words in Korean also helps visually disambiguate compounds, which Japanese lacks, since there are no spaces between words in Japanese. Here are some final thoughts on this aspect. Korean vocabulary is easier to decode over time because of its consistency, despite the density of Sino-Korean roots. Japanese vocabulary is irregular and layered, requiring significantly more memorization and contextual awareness. This doesn't mean Korean is easy, only that it gives learners more tools for educated guesses, while Japanese demands constant exposure and repetition. Now for the third aspect, grammar. At first glance, Korean and Japanese grammar appear quite similar, and in many respects they are. Both languages follow SOV, subject, object, verb, word order. They use postpositional particles to mark grammatical roles. They are agglutinative, meaning they build up meaning through verb endings and suffixes. There's a lack of grammatical gender or number agreement. Instead, they rely heavily on context, whether something is singular or plural. But once you go beyond the surface, the differences in complexity, regularity, and usage patterns become clear. And each language poses its own kind of difficulty. The sentence structure and particles are parallel, but not identical. Both languages use particles to define subject, object, topic, direction, and location, but they do so with differing complexity. Japanese has a relatively compact set of particles. Ga for the subject, o for the object, wa for the topic, ni for to and at, de, at and in, and so on. Korean particles had similar grammatical functions, but with phonological variation. I, ga for the subject, ur or rur for the object, nun for the topic, a for to and eso for at and from. Korean particles change depending on whether the preceding word ends in a consonant or a vowel, which adds a layer of complexity for learners. Both languages make clear grammatical distinctions between static locations, being somewhere, and where some action is carried out. These distinctions are grammatical and explicit in both languages. There's no meaningful differences in clarity. In both cases, learners must memorize which particles pair with which type of verbs or expressions. Next, we have contextual use and omission. Japanese frequently omits particles in informal speech. It's common to drop o, ga, or even ni, especially when the meaning is clear from the context in informal speech. Korean also allows particle omission, particularly in casual speech, but less frequently than Japanese. Korean tends to retain more grammatical marking in both speech and writing, offering more surface clarity. Now let's take a look at verb conjugation, regularity versus phonological variation. Japanese verbs are mostly regular with two main groups, the ru verbs and the u verbs. And basically, there are only two irregular verbs, suru, to do, and kuru, to come. Once learners understand the conjugation types, the patterns are predictable and mechanical. Korean verbs are regular in root structure, but more prone to phonologically triggered irregularities. In other words, the pronunciation changes, especially when verb stems end in consonants. These often involve stem changes when conjugated. Both languages form tenses, moods, and aspects through suffixation, and neither language requires subject-verb agreement based on number or person, which simplifies many aspects of sentence construction. Then we have omission and implicit meaning. Japanese is highly elliptical. It often omits the subject, object, or even the verb if it is understood from context. This minimalist style is efficient, but can be opaque or difficult for learners. Korean allows for omission, but tends to retain more sentence elements, especially in writing or formal speech. This makes Korean generally more transparent for decoding sentence roles and meanings. Okay, some final thoughts on grammar. Grammatically, both Korean and Japanese require careful attention to word order, particles, and verb structure. But Korean often demands more phonological awareness. In other words, the changes in pronunciation, especially with irregular forms and particle variation, and has a slightly more explicit grammatical surface. Japanese grammar is structurally simpler in many ways, but the high degree of ellipsis and context dependence makes it harder to interpret, especially for beginners. Each language offers its own form of elegance and its own traps for the unwary learner. Now for aspect 4, pronunciation. Its simplicity versus subtlety. When comparing pronunciation, Japanese is often seen easier, while Korean poses more challenges. But the full story depends on whether you're focusing on speaking clearly, listening comprehension, or mastery of prosody and nuance. As mentioned, Japanese has a simple, compact sound system. There are 5 vowels, a, I, u, e, o, with some of them having a long form. 15 consonants, mostly open syllables, consonant vowel or vowel, with very few words ending in a consonant, with the exception of N. No tones, but it does have pitch accent. This makes it relatively easy to pronounce individual words, and learners often sound reasonably natural early on. Korean, in contrast, has a richer, more complex phonological system. 10 basic vowels plus diphthongs, 19 consonants, including aspirated and tensed glottalized pairs, final consonants that are pronounced in reduced forms and affect the next syllable. There's no pitch accent like in Japanese or tones like in Chinese, but it has a strong phonological assimilation in fast speech, meaning the sounds meld together to create a different sound. Korean's range of sounds allows for more contrast between words, but also increases the learning curve, especially when trying to pronounce things naturally in real-time speech. One of the most overlooked pronunciation challenges in Japanese is its pitch accent system. Every word has a specific high to low pattern that distinguishes meaning in some cases. It's quite a complex subject, and I won't get into it deeply here, but I can recommend 2 great videos that explain this, and the links are in the description. I'll play for you a little bit from each video so you can get a better idea what it is.
Hi, I'm Kaname. In this video, I'm going to teach you the basics of Japanese pitch accent. Just like English has the stress accent, Japanese also has something like stress. We call it accent. When the mora has an accent, we pronounce the mora at a higher pitch. For example, ongaku means music, and this word ongaku has the accent on the first mora o. So we pronounce O at a higher pitch. Ongaku, ongaku. Kudamono has the accent on the second mora, da. So we pronounce the second mora at a higher pitch. Kudamono, kudamono. So how should you pronounce a word? It depends on the location of the accent.
Rule number 1. The first syllable and the second syllable always differ in pitch. If the first syllable is high, the second syllable has to be low, and vice versa. Rule number 2. The pitch only drops once in a word. Once in a word. In other words, if the pitch rises again, it means it's another word. So these are the 2 important rules. The first pitch and second pitch always differs. The pitch only drops once in a word. Now let's see the types of pitch. The pitch patterns can be divided into 2 categories. One is without an accent and the other is with an accent. When the pitch falls, we say there's an accent there. So if the pitch doesn't fall, there's no accent. The words which belong to the first category are those with no accents. For example, America, America. America starts low, then moves high, and then continues to be high until the end. There's no fall in the pitch, and イギリス is the same. イギリス
While pitch accent is often ignored in early stages of learning and usually doesn't hinder communication, it does affect native-like fluency, and mastering it takes serious listening and speaking practice. Korean, on the other hand, is syllable timed with no pitch accent or tones, as I mentioned. Its rhythm is more uniform and intonation varies more by sentence type or emotion than word meaning. So learners don't need to memorize pitch contours, which can be a relief. But fluent Korean requires navigating subtle phonetic reductions, which makes listening harder. So concerning listening comprehension challenges, in the case of Japanese, it's easy to segment words due to simple syllables, but there's a high homophone density and limited sounds. Pitch accent is not marked in writing, so listening practice is crucial to disambiguate. In the case of Korean, words are often mushed together in fluent speech. Consonant assimilation, elision, and linking between syllables make even known words hard to catch. Understanding native speech requires learning sound change patterns. So when it comes to pronunciation regularity, Japanese is phonetically consistent. Kana's script matches pronunciation well, and most syllables are pronounced as written. Once exceptions like wa for the subject and o for direct object are learned, there's little deviation to worry about. Korean spelling is logical thanks to Hangul, but actual pronunciation often diverges due to morphophonemic rules. Final consonants sound different than they look. Adjacent sounds affect one another in predictable but in non-obvious ways. What you write is not what you always hear. Some final thoughts on pronunciation. Japanese pronunciation is easy to produce at a basic level and consistent with its writing system when using kana. But native-like fluency requires subtle pitch patterns that aren't marked in writing. On the other hand, Korean pronunciation involves more articulation complexity, more sound change, and more listening difficulty, even though Hangul itself is logically constructed. In short, Japanese pronunciation is simpler. Korean pronunciation is clearer in theory, but harder in practice. Now for the final aspect, politeness systems. If there's one area where both Korean and Japanese shine in their complexity, it is in their systems of politeness and honorifics. These are not just about showing good manners. They are embedded into the grammar itself and reflect age, status, familiarity, and social hierarchy. But while both languages share the same cultural foundation and respect and deference, the mechanisms they use to express politeness differ significantly. In Japanese, politeness is primarily expressed through three systems: polite language, keigo, the use of mas forms in verbs; honorific language, keigo, used to elevate the subject; and humble language, kenjogo, used to lower oneself in relation to the listener. This system affects verb forms. For example, you have the verb to go, a simple form, iku, the mas form, ikimasu, which is normal politeness level. Then the honorific is much longer, irashaimasu. And then the humble form, mairimasu. And there are many different pronouns. For example, for I, watashi, boku, ore. And you have to be very careful in choosing your pronouns. Actually, in Japanese, we try to avoid using pronouns. We just drop them or use something else instead, like a teacher, sensei. Or at a store, they might say, okyakusan, honorable customer, and so on. And then there are vocabulary choices. It's not just grammar. In other words, sometimes there are multiple words for the same thing, and the one you choose indicates the politeness level. So politeness in Japanese often requires learning entirely new words to express respect. It's highly lexical, meaning you need to memorize separate forms and recognize whom to use them with and when. However, most daily interactions can be handled with just two levels: plain form for close friends, your inner circle, and general politeness level, the mas form, desu, masu, for verb endings. Mastering the deeper honorific levels is essential in formal settings, business, or hierarchical environments, but they're often acquired gradually. In the case of Korean, verb endings are the main vehicle of politeness. Korean politeness operates through a hierarchical speech level system with specific verb endings and occasionally variations to reflect respect or formality. According to the Standard Korean Language Dictionary, there are 6 major speech levels, each associated with a specific tone of politeness or formality.
하십시오체. 감사합니다.
Formal polite, common in public speech, official settings.
하오체. 오시오.
Semi-formal, rare in modern speech.
하게체. 가게나.
Used by elders to juniors.
헤라체. 먹어라.
Plain directional, common in writing, commands.
해요체. 괜찮아요.
Polite but casual, used in everyday conversation.
해체. 이리 와.
Intimate, casual, informal.
The most commonly used in modern spoken Korean are
해요체.
polite and friendly,
해체.
casual for close friends or family,
하십시오체.
formal, used with strangers in media and in public announcements. Unlike Japanese, Korean does not require entirely new verbs to express politeness, only in a few cases.
먹다.
To eat,
드시다. 잡수시다.
to eat. Honorific,
마시다.
to drink,
드시다.
to drink. Honorific,
자다.
to sleep,
주무시다.
to sleep. Honorific,
있다.
to be, to have,
계시다.
to be. Honorific,
있으시다.
to have. Honorific,
죽다.
to die,
돌아가시다.
to die. Honorific,
말하다.
to speak,
말씀하시다.
to speak. Honorific,
주다.
to give,
드리다.
to give. Humble,
주시다.
to give. Honorific,
You modify the verb ending instead. However, mastering Korean honorifics still requires understanding when to use speech levels, recognizing subject honorific markers.
for example, the suffix
시.
is inserted into a verb stem to show respect toward the subject of the sentence, typically when the subject is an elder or superior, someone being addressed formally, a customer, guest, or stranger.
가다.
To go,
가시다. 가세요.
he or she goes. Respectfully, talking about a teacher, guest, elder.
오다.
To come,
오시다. 오셨어요.
she came. Honorific,
아버지 오셨어요.
did your father come?
있다. 계시다. 계세요.
Honorific, he or she is.
사장님 계세요.
The director is here.
And learning honorific noun forms.
집. 댁.
House or home. Is the teacher at home?
선생님 댁에 계세요? 나이. 연세.
Age. What is your grandfather's age?
할아버지 연세가 어떻게 되세요? 이름. 성함.
Name. What is your name?
성함이 어떻게 되세요? 병. 경환.
Illness. How is your illness?
경환은 어떠세요?
This system is grammatically embedded, which means learners must learn it early and consistently to communicate appropriately. So here are some final thoughts on the politeness levels. Japanese politeness relies more on changing words. You often have to learn new verbs entirely to show respect. Korean politeness is handled more through verb endings and suffixes, but the choice of speech level is just as critical, and it's woven directly into every sentence you speak. In both cases, you're not just learning a language, you're learning a social code. I would say that they are equally challenging. So overall, which is more difficult, Japanese or Korean? Honestly, that depends on what your goals are and how you learn best. If you're looking for a language with simpler pronunciation, more predictable grammar, and consistent writing, Japanese may feel easier at the earlier stages, but it demands a huge commitment to mastering kanji, multiple readings, and layered honorific forms. If you're drawn to logical spelling, structured vocabulary, and deeply integrated grammar, Korean may appeal to your analytical side, but its phonology, speech level system, and reduced spoken forms can make it tough to follow in real time. I hope my analysis here has helped you see not just which language might be more difficult, but how each one challenges and rewards you in different ways. Whichever path you choose, you're not just learning grammar or vocabulary, you're unlocking a whole way of thinking and being. And if you are interested in my lifelong journey, in which I've traveled to, as of now, 101 countries, and having studied up to 47 languages, using more extensively around 30 of them over the past 5 to 6 decades, then please visit Polyglot Dreams, my website, where my memoir, A Life in 30 Languages, is available not just in English, but many other languages, and also as dual editions. In other words, combined together. For example, English-Japanese, or English-Spanish, or Spanish-Portuguese, etc. On top of that, I've created learning sets. In other words, there are audiobook forms, and you can acquire the dual language ebooks along with the audio to greatly increase your listening comprehension and overall fluency in your target language. In the memoir, I share my experiences in all these different languages and cultures, but also my insights into language learning based not just on my own personal experience, but also the research I carried out for more than 30 years into the areas of foreign language acquisition and cross-cultural adaptation. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video.